Her name was Natalie Brooks. On the night of Eleanor Brooks' 80th birthday celebration, the most powerful woman in the family, Natalie was told to sit beside the catering area during dinner. Not with her parents, not with her cousins, and not even inside the main banquet hall. Her chair had been placed right next to the kitchen doors, where staff members constantly passed by carrying trays of hot food. And the most painful part was that no one in the family seemed to think there was anything unusual about it. The riverside mansion in Savannah glowed beneath warm golden lights. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the towering ceilings. Laughter echoed throughout the grand hall. Guests wore expensive outfits. Glasses of red wine shimmered beneath the candlelight. It was the kind of celebration that made people believe they were looking at a perfect family. But Natalie knew better than anyone. The Brooks family had never been perfect. They had simply become very good at hiding the truth. Natalie stepped through the mansion's iron gates, carrying a small gift box in her hands. She had driven nearly 4 hours from Charleston to attend the celebration. During the drive, she kept thinking about the last message her mother had sent. "Please don't cause any trouble tonight. This is an important day for Grandma." Natalie read the message over and over again. Then she laughed softly. Because for all 34 years of her life, she had always been the one expected to stay quiet. When she was a child, every time Vanessa did something wrong, Natalie was told to let it go. Whenever Vanessa lost her temper, Natalie was expected to be understanding. Whenever Vanessa took something that belonged to her, Natalie was taught that mature people didn't argue. The family always described Natalie as the easy child. But over time, she came to understand something. In many toxic families, being easy is simply another way of saying forgotten. Vanessa Brooks was 2 years older than Natalie. Beautiful, charming, always the center of attention in every room she entered. Since childhood, Vanessa had been treated like a precious treasure by the entire family. Every achievement was celebrated. Every mistake was forgiven. Natalie was the opposite. She studied hard, worked tirelessly, bought her first apartment with her own savings. Yet somehow none of those things were ever enough to be noticed. A year earlier, during a family gathering, Natalie had overheard Aunt Diane proudly telling a group of guests, "Vanessa was born to do great things. Natalie just enjoys a simple life." Everyone nodded in agreement. No one realized it wasn't a compliment. It was the way they made her smaller, so she would fit the story they wanted to tell. Inside the ballroom, soft, classical music floated through the air. Natalie greeted distant relatives with a polite smile. But every smile she received quickly shifted back toward Vanessa, just as it always had. A few minutes later, the event coordinator approached her. She checked the guest list and suddenly hesitated. "Excuse me, Miss Brooks?" Natalie nodded. "Yes?" The woman pointed toward the far end of the room. "Your seat is over there." Natalie followed her gesture. The smile slowly faded from her face. A small table sat near the kitchen entrance. There was only one chair, completely separated from the main seating area. At first, she assumed there had been a mistake. But there hadn't. Her name was clearly printed on the place card. Natalie Brooks. She sat down. The smell of hot food and the sound of dishes clattering echoed behind her. From that spot, she could see the entire room. She could see her parents laughing with guests. She could see Vanessa standing in the center of the crowd like a queen, and yet she felt as though she were 1,000 miles away from all of them. A little while later, Vanessa walked over. Her emerald green dress sparkled beneath the lights. The smile on her face looked as flawless as ever. Vanessa glanced at Natalie's chair and shrugged. "At least you got a seat." Natalie remained silent. Vanessa tilted her head. "Honestly, you should feel lucky. Not everyone gets invited to events like this." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Natalie sitting alone among the laughter and music. But this time, something felt different. The familiar pain never arrived. Instead, a strange sense of calm settled over her. As if after years of enduring disappointment, a part of her had finally stopped expecting fairness. Natalie slowly looked around the room, and that was when she noticed something no one else seemed to see. In the hallway beside the ballroom stood a glass display case filled with historical documents belonging to the Brooks family. Among old photographs and faded maps, one document immediately caught her attention. a surname she had never seen before. Whitmore. Natalie had never heard that name in all 34 years of being part of the family, but what struck her as strange was where the document had been placed. It sat directly beside her grandparents' wedding photograph, as though it had once been extremely important. Then a low voice spoke from behind her. "You're Natalie Brooks, aren't you?" Natalie turned around. An older man wearing a gray suit stood there. He studied her for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes, only curiosity. After several seconds of silence, he asked a question that left Natalie completely frozen. "Has Eleanor never told you about the Whitmore estate?" Natalie stared at the man. Her heart suddenly began to pound, because for the first time in her life, she had the unmistakable feeling that her family was hiding a secret far bigger than anything she had ever imagined. Natalie Brooks barely slept that night. After the party ended, the older man's question continued to circle through her mind. "Has Eleanor never told you about the Whitmore estate?" The name felt like a door that had suddenly appeared in the middle of a wall Natalie had been staring at her entire life. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Savannah River, she checked out of the hotel earlier than planned. She didn't drive back to Charleston. Instead, she headed to the county records archive. It was an old red brick building tucked between quiet streets. No one in her family knew she was there, and Natalie wanted to keep it that way. The archive was managed by a woman in her 60s with thick glasses and a gentle voice. When Natalie asked about the Brooks family and the name Whitmore, the woman looked briefly surprised. "Just give me a moment." She disappeared behind rows of towering file shelves. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying 3 dusty cardboard boxes. Natalie opened the first one. Inside were property records dating back decades. The pages had yellowed with age. The signatures were nearly faded away. But one detail appeared again and again. Whitmore, Whitmore Estate, Whitmore Trust, Whitmore Holdings. Natalie felt her heartbeat begin to quicken. Her family had never mentioned any of these names. Not once. Not during family gatherings. Not in stories about her grandparents. Not in any conversation she could remember. Yet the documents in front of her made one thing clear. Whitmore had once been a very important part of the family's history. 2 hours later, Natalie discovered something even more shocking. Multiple properties connected to the Whitmore name had once belonged to her grandfather. Not just one. An entire chain of assets stretched along the coast of Maine. Vacation homes, waterfront land, investments, trust funds, all of them worth a tremendous amount of money. She sat quietly staring at the numbers. A cold feeling ran down her spine. If these assets existed, why had nobody ever talked about them? That afternoon, Natalie drove to the address the older man had written down for her at the party, a small house just outside Savannah. The man who answered the door was Walter Pierce, 72 years old, a former chief accountant for the Brooks family. He invited Natalie inside. The living room was simple but neatly organized. Stacks of documents had already been arranged across the table, as though he had known this day would eventually come. Walter studied Natalie for a long moment. He saw traces of her late grandfather in her face, especially in her eyes, honest, calm, difficult to manipulate. Finally, he let out a long sigh. "I always thought they would tell you the truth." Natalie spoke softly. "What truth?" Walter leaned back in his chair. "Many years ago, your grandfather established 2 trust funds. One was public. Everyone knew about it. The other was kept secret." Natalie felt her palms begin to grow cold. Walter continued. He didn't want the family's wealth ending up in the hands of people who cared only about status and appearances. He believed the true heir should be someone with character. Not the most popular person. Not the most celebrated person. Natalie immediately thought of Vanessa. Then she thought about all the years she had been treated like an outsider. Walter noticed the expression on her face. He slowly nodded. "Yes, your grandfather saw the same things you're thinking about right now." The room fell silent. Outside the window, tree branches swayed gently in the wind. Natalie felt pieces of her childhood rising to the surface. The times she had been overlooked. The time she had been dismissed. The time she had been told to step aside. For the first time in her life, those scattered pieces seemed to fit together. But what Walter said next left her completely stunned. Someone in your family intentionally hid the existence of that trust. Natalie looked up. Who? Walter remained silent for several seconds. I don't have enough evidence to accuse anyone directly, but I know certain documents disappeared after your grandfather passed away. And the people who benefited most from that disappearance are the same people running the Brooks family today. Natalie felt a heavy weight settle inside her chest. For the first time, she no longer believed this was simply favoritism. This was a secret that had been buried for years, a secret someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. Walter slowly stood up. He walked into his office. Several minutes later, he returned carrying an old yellow envelope. The corners were worn from age. He placed it carefully in front of Natalie. I've kept this for more than 10 years, waiting for the right person to come. Natalie stared at the handwriting on the front of the envelope. It was familiar, her grandfather's handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly, because only one sentence had been written on the front. For Natalie Brooks, only when you are ready to know the truth. In that moment, Natalie understood that her life was about to change forever. And the biggest secret the Brooks family had ever hidden was finally beginning to reveal itself. Natalie Brooks did not open the letter right away. She took it back to Charleston, then placed it on the dining table in her small apartment overlooking the harbor. For 2 straight days, she simply sat there staring at the old envelope, as if it did not contain a few pages of paper, but the answer to an entire lifetime. On the evening of the 3rd day, she finally opened it. The faint scent of aged paper drifted into the air. Then her grandfather's familiar handwriting appeared before her eyes. Dear Natalie, if you are reading these words, it means the truth has finally found its way to you. Natalie felt her throat tighten. Her grandfather had passed away when she was in her early 20s. He had been one of the very few people in the family who truly saw her. In the letter, he wrote about the final years of his life, about the quiet conflicts that existed within the family, about his fear that the family's wealth would eventually fall into the hands of people who measured everything by money. But what left Natalie completely stunned was the final section. He had named her the primary heir of the Whitmore Trust. Not Vanessa, not anyone else. Natalie. Because, as he wrote, she was the only person in the family who had never asked him about money. Natalie read that passage again. And then again. And again. For 34 years, she had always believed she was the forgotten one. Yet all along, someone had been quietly paying attention. Someone who understood exactly what was happening better than anyone else. The following morning, Natalie's phone rang. It was Walter Pierce. He spoke only one sentence. The Whitmore Trust Board is meeting in Portland this weekend. I think you should be there. 3 days later, Natalie stood in front of an old stone building overlooking Portland Bay. Flags snapped in the ocean wind. Members of the board were arriving one by one, and the biggest surprise of all was waiting for her there. The Brooks family had also come. Vanessa, Aunt Diane, her parents, even Eleanor. Every one of them was present. The atmosphere inside the meeting room was so tense that almost nobody seemed willing to speak. Natalie noticed countless eyes turning toward her. Some curious, some nervous, some openly annoyed. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. Are you really going to do this? Natalie looked at her calmly. Do what? Dig up the past. Vanessa folded her arms. We're family. Natalie nearly laughed. It was the first time in years she had heard Vanessa use the word family when talking about her. The meeting began shortly afterward. The chairman stood and addressed the room. Documents Natalie had already seen at the archives appeared on the large screen. Then more documents followed, records even Natalie had never seen before. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Several board members exchanged glances. Others opened the files in front of them with visible shock. Then came the first major blow. A copy of her grandfather's supplemental will. Natalie Brooks' name was clearly written on the document, primary heir to the Whitmore Trust. The room fell completely silent. Vanessa jumped to her feet. That's impossible. There has to be some mistake. But before anyone could respond, Walter stood up. He presented another collection of documents. This time it was not a will. It was a record of years of alterations and edits, documents that had been removed, records that had been concealed, meeting notes that had never been disclosed. Slowly, a complete picture began to emerge. Someone had deliberately hidden the existence of the Whitmore Trust. Someone had made sure Natalie would never learn about her inheritance rights. Eyes throughout the room slowly turned toward Aunt Diane. Her face had gone pale. Vanessa looked at her mother, then back at the documents spread across the table. For the first time in her life, the confidence she always carried disappeared from her face. Natalie remained seated. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was speaking for itself. The chairman slowly read the final passage from her grandfather's letter. If there is still one person in this family worthy of protecting the Whitmore legacy, it is Natalie, the one who has always valued people more than money. Every word echoed through the silent room. Natalie's father lowered his head. Her mother turned away. Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment, and Vanessa simply sat there motionless, as though she was realizing for the first time that the world did not revolve around her. After several minutes of silence, Natalie slowly stood. Everyone expected her to be angry, to accuse, to seek revenge, but she did none of those things. She simply looked at each person in the room, then asked a single question. If I was truly as worthless as all of you always said, why did you spend so many years trying to hide me? No one answered. Not a single person. Because everyone already knew the truth. It was never because Natalie was weak. It was never because she was unimportant. It was because they were afraid. Afraid of the day she would discover who she truly was. Afraid of the day the person they had spent years looking down on would finally step out of the shadow they had created. And now, that day had finally arrived. When the meeting ended, the chairman officially announced the decision. Control of the Whitmore Trust would be transferred to Natalie Brooks. In that moment, the entire room fell silent. But Natalie knew this was only the beginning, because some truths do more than change a will when they are finally revealed. They destroy lies that have survived for decades. 3 weeks after the meeting in Portland, Natalie Brooks' name appeared in more local newspapers than she had ever imagined. Not because of a scandal, not because of a legal battle, but because people were curious about the woman who had unexpectedly become the new manager of the Whitmore Trust. Meanwhile, the Brooks family was experiencing some of the most difficult days they had faced in years. Phone calls poured in constantly. Business partners began asking questions. Several board members stepped down. The same people who had once praised the Brooks family as the perfect example of success now spoke about them only in whispers. No one was arrested. No one went to court, but the reputation they had spent decades building was beginning to crack, and sometimes that is the most expensive price of all. Natalie paid little attention to any of it. She was busy with her own life. In the mornings, she went to school. In the afternoons, she met with the trust's financial advisors. In the evenings, she reviewed documents late into the night. For the first time in her life, she no longer spent her time wondering what her family thought of her. One afternoon near the end of the month, her phone vibrated. It was her mother. Natalie stared at the screen for a long time. Eventually, she answered. The line remained silent for several seconds. Then her mother spoke first. I'd like to see you. Natalie did not answer right away. This woman had been at the center of so much of her pain, not because she was cruel, but because she had always chosen to look away. I know. Her mother's voice trembled slightly. I know I don't have the right to ask anything from you, but please, just once. Natalie closed her eyes. In the end, she agreed. A week later, they met at the lakeside cabin her grandfather had loved for years. The property was part of the Whitmore Trust. The lake was so calm it looked like a giant mirror. A gentle breeze moved through the rows of pine trees. Everything felt strangely peaceful. When Natalie stepped inside, she saw all of them. Her parents, Eleanor, Aunt Diane, and Vanessa. None of them looked the way she remembered. Her father seemed much older. Eleanor no longer carried the commanding presence she once had, and Vanessa, the woman who used to walk into every room as though the world belonged to her, now sat quietly staring down at her hands. No one knew how to begin. Finally, her father spoke. I'm sorry. Natalie looked up. He had never been a man who found it easy to talk about his feelings. But today, his voice sounded rough and tired. I saw what was happening all those years, and I did nothing. Natalie said nothing, because deep down, she knew it was true. Her mother began to cry. I always thought keeping the peace in the family was enough. I thought ignoring the problems would make everyone happy. But I was wrong. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew heavy. One apology followed another. There were no excuses, no blame, only the truth. Finally, Vanessa stood up. She walked over and stopped in front of Natalie. The woman who had once been treated like the family's treasure no longer carried even a trace of arrogance. "I hated you," Vanessa said. Everyone froze, but she continued. "I hated you because Grandpa was always proud of you. I hated you because you never had to fight for his approval, yet he loved you anyway. I hated you because every time I looked at you, I knew I wasn't as good as everyone thought I was." Tears rolled down Vanessa's cheeks. "I spent my entire life competing in a battle that only existed inside my own head." Natalie looked at her. For the first time, she no longer felt angry, she only felt sadness. A deep sadness. For both of them. For all the years that had been lost. For a family that had spent so long hurting itself. Eleanor slowly stood. "I failed." Her voice sounded weaker than Natalie had ever heard before. "I saw everything, but I thought time would fix it. I never imagined my silence would make things worse." Outside, small ripples moved across the lake. The setting sun painted the room in soft shades of gold. Natalie looked at each person standing before her. People who had hurt her, but people who now carried genuine regret. After a long silence, she smiled. It was a small, gentle smile. "I forgive all of you." The entire room seemed to stop breathing. But Natalie continued. "Forgiveness doesn't mean things will go back to the way they were. I spent my entire life trying to find a place at this family's table. I don't need that anymore. I have my own life. I have my own path, and I'm happy with that." No one said another word, because they all understood. Some doors, once closed, can never be reopened in the same way. A month later, Natalie made her first major decision as manager of the Whitmore Trust. Instead of expanding the family's wealth, she established a scholarship foundation for underprivileged students. Children who were constantly underestimated, children who were often overlooked, children just like she had once been. On the morning of the scholarship program's launch, Natalie stood on a dock watching the sunrise. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the water. Her phone vibrated inside her pocket. A text message from her mother. Only a few simple words, "I'm proud of you." Natalie read the message, smiled, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. Once upon a time, those were the words she had desperately wanted to hear. But now, she no longer needed them to understand her own worth. The breeze moved gently through her hair. The lake sparkled beneath the morning light. For the first time in many years, Natalie no longer felt forgotten. She no longer felt like someone else's shadow. She was simply herself. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory of all. Greater than any inheritance. Greater than any apology, greater than all the lost years, because in the end, the person her entire family had underestimated was the only one strong enough to move forward without carrying hatred in her heart. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Stories like Natalie's remind us that the truth has a way of finding its way into the light, no matter how long it has been hidden. Sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones who never truly knew our worth. Now we'd love to hear from you. If you were Natalie, would you have forgiven your family? Or would you have walked away for good? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy emotional family drama stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories every week.